Good evening, welcome to George Washington University. My name is Samara, and I head up special projects and events for the School of Media and Public Affairs here. A few words about the School of Media and Public Affairs, which is serving as host for this evening's fabulous panel. We are unique in that we teach both journalism and mass communication, and one of the first university in the world to offer an undergraduate degree in political communication as well. We also have two master's programs, one in strategic communication and one in global communication, which are both accepting applications if you're so inclined. We are proud to host this evening's event, very representative of the kinds of events that we host to bring professionals to campus for our students to learn from those on the front lines of media and communication. This evening, we were very blessed to have a special partner in the Overseas Press Club, who were very integral for us to put this event together, and we thank them for that. Speaking of the Overseas Press Club, this evening I'd like to welcome Michael Serrill to the stage. He is president of the Overseas Press Club and assistant managing editor of Bloomberg Markets Magazine. He is a former foreign editor at Businessweek and Time Magazine. Michael?
Thank you, Samara. Welcome all of you to one of the larger events that the Overseas Press Club has hosted. I'm glad there was such strong interest in this topic, which is freedom of the press in Pakistan. The Overseas Press Club has had a long interest in this topic. I edited a story for a magazine that we put out called Dateline back in 2008. Written by Shahan Mufti, some of whom you may be familiar with, which was actually rather positive. It was during the regime of General Musharraf, who had approved the creation of a bunch of private television stations that were systematically undermining his regime, but forced to declare his allegiance to freedom of the press. He didn't do as much as he could have to prevent them from broadcasting. I'll just finish by recommending to you a marvelous report that was done last May by the Committee to Protect Journalists on Pakistan and the press and the constant conflict between the security forces and reporters in that country. And with that, I will introduce OPC board member and the organizer of this event, Azmat Khan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming. It's really gratifying to see so much interest in what we're doing tonight and the amazing panelists we brought together. And I want to thank the School of Media and Public Affairs for being such wonderful partners. And I want to echo a little bit of what Michael just told you about the OPC. Our mission is to advance serious foreign reporting and advance freedom of press around the world. And when we started planning this event, we knew that we wanted to be true to that mission, but that we also wanted to do something different from what you ordinarily hear about Pakistan, and particularly in DC, where talks about US-Pakistan relations are a dime a dozen. So we decided to highlight underreported stories that are harder to tell and the growing challenges thrown at the journalists who tell those stories. So tonight we're honored to be able to bring together this very distinguished group of journalists who've been spending years in the country pursuing stories that often get overlooked and worked in a range of mediums, from film and radio to print and the digital world. I want to begin by introducing Declan Walsh. He is the Pakistan bureau chief for the New York Times. He's originally from Ireland, where he attended school and started his journalism career at the weekly paper, the Sunday Business Post. There, he won a National Media Award in 1998 for his coverage of homelessness and drug addiction. A year later, he moved to Nairobi, Kenya, using the city as a base to cover sub-Saharan Africa for several media outlets, including The Independent and The Irish Times. In 2004, Declan moved to Pakistan as the Afghanistan and Pakistan correspondent for the British paper The Guardian, and quickly made a name for himself, reaching areas and reporting stories that no other foreign correspondents did. In January of 2011, Declan joined the New York Times as its bureau chief, leading its Pakistan coverage and reporting long-form magazine stories. His reporting has been shortlisted for several prizes, including the Orwell Prize. And I know he'll hate that I'm saying this, but he's also widely been hailed and considered by his peers as the best foreign correspondent in the country. In May of last year, Declan was expelled from Pakistan for unspecified, undesirable activities. He's now based in London and seeking a return to the country. Please welcome Declan. We're also joined tonight by Habiba Nosheen. She's a Peabody Award-winning Pakistani investigative journalist and filmmaker. She was born in Pakistan. She's fluent in Urdu, Hindi, Punjabi, and English. And she recently directed, produced, shot, and reported the film Outlawed in Pakistan, which navigates the country's fascinating judicial system through the case of Kainat Sumro, a 13-year-old girl who accused 4 men of gang rape. Habiba and her co-producers spent nearly 4 years probing Kainat's story as she took her case through the courts, as well as of her alleged rapists' quest to clear their names. The film premiered at Sundance last year and aired on the PBS series Frontline in May. Habiba has written for ample news outlets, and her radio documentary, What Happened at Dos Eres, aired on This American Life, and it was called a masterpiece of storytelling by The New Yorker. She's also reported for ProPublica, Time, NPR, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and many other outlets. Her reporting has won several major awards, including the George Foster Peabody Award, a Gracie Award, and 2 Overseas Press Club Awards. Habiba teaches radio and video reporting at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, where she also went to graduate school. Please welcome Habiba. We're also joined tonight by Sadia Shepard. She's a Pakistani-American documentary film producer and an author. Her 12-part documentary series, The Other Half of Tomorrow, explores contemporary Pakistan through the perspective of dynamic female changemakers, from a women's rights workshop in a rural village in Punjab to an underground dance academy in Karachi to the playing fields of the Pakistani women's cricket team. Her other film credits include The Education of Muhammad Hussain, a portrait of a traditional Muslim school in Detroit, Michigan, which recently premiered on HBO, and the September issue, an inside look at Vogue, which won the Grand Jury Prize for Excellence in Cinematography at the 2009 Sundance Film Festival. Her first book, a memoir entitled A Girl from Foreign, was published in 2008, and her writing has appeared in The Washington Post, The Times of India, The Wall Street Journal Magazine, and The New York Times. Please welcome Sadia. And finally tonight, we're honored to also have Richard Leiby, a senior writer at the Washington Post. Richard Leiby. He was the paper's bureau chief in Pakistan from January 2012 to June of last year. In addition to his reporting there, he shot and narrated videos for the Post's website. Over the last 23 years with the paper, Richard has taken on a staggering range of assignments, including ones in Iraq and Egypt, as well as Jerusalem and Gaza. And he also headed the Sunday Style section for 2 years. He's won numerous awards for his reporting, including a first-place award in feature writing in 1994 from the National Association of Black Journalists for a story about a young first-time offender sentenced to more than 19 years for cocaine dealing. His sentence was later commuted by President Clinton. He's also an adjunct professor here at the School of Media and Public Affairs. Please welcome Richard. So thank you all. It's great to have all of you here. I want to begin with a question about what sort of brought you to Pakistan. And I want to start with you, Habiba. You were born in the country. Tell me a little bit about what brought you there, what made you want to tell stories there. What started that?
I grew up in Canada. We left Pakistan when I was 9 years old, and you know, Pakistan has always been this place that we called home, but we also left, and it was sort of in our family conversation. Like, we didn't really go back often. My parents were too scared. They said it wasn't safe enough to go. And then, you know, when I turned 20 or something, I decided that I wanted to go back, and I initially did my master's dissertation, which looked at lesbians in Pakistan, as a women's studies major, and I went to Pakistan to report on the story. And while I was going, I was approached by the CBC to record my interviews. They said, "Would you consider doing a story for us?" And I was like, I have no idea what that would entail. I have no experience in journalism whatsoever. And they said, "No, it's fine. We'll teach you." And I came back with my interviews, and I worked with the editors to produce a 20-minute radio doc on the topic. And it was the most exciting thing I think I've ever done in my life up till that point. And I just said, this is what I want to do. And that kept me coming back to Pakistan. But it was also, once I produced that story, I felt like there were so many of those stories that needed to be told that I just felt like that's what I want to do, go back to Pakistan and tell underreported stories.
I'm really curious about, I listened to the NPR story that you did a few years later about two lesbians who live in Lahore in secret. But tell us a little bit more about how you found that story, how hard it was to dig into finding these characters, maybe the environment for how much issues like that are covered in Pakistan, and any obstacles in the process.
Yeah, I mean, so the NPR story was actually a follow-up I did 5 years later, which was a 7-minute piece, and I went back and followed the same woman that I had done for the CBC radio doc, and by then, the first part for the CBC, she was really, she would describe herself as suicidal. She was considering committing suicide, and she's like, there's just no place for a woman who's not attracted to men in a place like Pakistan. And during the reporting, she decided to tell her grandmother that she was a lesbian, and it was sort of, her news was taken so dismissively that she said it just re-emphasized for her that there was just no place for her in the country. But she didn't want to leave. She wanted to be a human rights lawyer in Pakistan. She had the means to leave, so she stayed. And then 5 years later, when I went back, she had married a guy. Shortly after the airing of the first film, doc, she had married a guy. They divorced within 6 months because she had met a woman who she fell in love with.
But how did she meet that woman?
So they were apparently at a party. And because the circle of, I guess, lesbians in Pakistan is very small, they all heard this piece that was done, the first doc. And when she met some woman who was talking, she said, your voice sounds very familiar. Did you hear that radio doc? And she said, well, yeah. It's like, is that you? And she said, yeah, that's me. So they, she's like, please tell me you didn't end up marrying the guy. And she's like, I did. And that's how they came together. And I'm in touch with them still, and they're still together. So
incredible. For those of you who are following online, we're using the hashtag #reportingpak. And I tweeted Habiba's story out earlier, the NPR piece, so you can find it that way. But Declan, you've also made a name in telling underreported stories, and I think that one of the most incredible and interesting ones has been about knowing Pakistan through its railway systems. And it was published, I think, in May. Tell us a little bit about that and what made you want to tell that story and how you did it. Tell us a little bit about the process.
It started off from a pretty simple premise. I just wanted to find a way of telling a sort of a broad story about Pakistan, a story that was both broad and specific. For years I'd been covering Pakistan through the lens of all the big news, dramatic news events. So the sort of bombings and the political crises, and the events like the Osama operation and so on. And one of the complaints that one gets as a foreign reporter based in Pakistan, from Pakistanis particularly, is that you're not giving a sense of real life or of the daily life that most people experience. So I thought that taking a train ride was one way of seeing the country through a new sort of lens, because most of my time in Pakistan I've been traveling by road or by plane. I thought it was interesting in that sense. The second reason was because it's a state enterprise, and part of the story of Pakistan in recent years has been the sort of crumbling of state enterprises. The national airline, PIA, which was previously a very proud airline, certainly in the 60s and 70s, has taken a pretty serious turn for the worse in recent years, as anyone who's used it will tell you. There's, you know, the power is a huge issue. There's massive electricity shortages all across the country. And one of the sort of lesser appreciated aspects is that the state rail company, Pakistan Railways, has also seen this sort of precipitous decline. So I wanted to tell, tell that story as well, to tell the story of sort of the crumbling of the state in one small way. And then the third reason, really, I suppose, was that, you know, for me, the railways have a sort of quite romantic association with subcontinent. I mean, I come from Ireland, and not being British, certainly, I think British people have a sort of a schooling in the lore of the subcontinent that comes because of the colonial experience. So they know about, you know, Kipling and the frontier and all these things. As an Irish person, I have much less of that. But when I came to Pakistan, one of the things I did have was, you know, one had seen the movie Gandhi and lots of movies set there. And there's always sort of a scene with the train sweeping, a sort of slightly romantic image. So, and trains also played an important part in the formation of Pakistan, because when partition occurred, a lot of people moved from India. Those Mahajirs, people who had moved from northern India into this new country, had arrived by train, and that both had, you know, positive associations in that it was, you know, the sort of the brash and exciting formation of another country, and also had quite tragic ones, because a lot of people were killed on trains during the carnage of partition. So for all of those reasons, I just thought that maybe this was a good time to, or a good opportunity to look at the country through a new lens.
How long did it take you to report? And I'm very curious, when we talk about these stories that are a tougher sell, they're not necessarily nimble to the news curve. I'm curious about how editors take it, how papers take it. How much convincing needs to happen to make a story like that happen?
To be perfectly honest, I thought it was going to be harder with this one than it was, because it was quite off the beaten track. Mm-hmm. It wasn't on a sort of hot button issue like the Taliban or nuclear weapons or anything. But luckily enough, for a lot of the editors at the Times, they were taken by this idea of looking at it in a new way. But it was complicated. It was complicated for several reasons. One was that we were passing all the way across the country from Peshawar down to Karachi. I originally actually wanted to take it from Khyber, which is right on the Afghan border, all the way down to Karachi. But that's not possible, simply for the reason that the train line, Pakistan's almost its last steam train line, is this beautiful train that runs through the Khyber, through the tribal areas from the border down to Peshawar. But that train line hasn't been operational for several years now, as I discovered when I went up there. It's got the line, the actual physical line was washed away in the floods in 2010. And even if it hadn't been, I don't think that train line would run now, because there's so much violence in that particular part of the country. We also had, obviously, an important part of the story was that we would have photographs or video, and eventually the photographer Andrea Bruce, some of whose photographs were playing here just before we came in, we had to get her to come. As often with journalists coming to Pakistan, there are all sorts of issues with visas and access and so on. We had to square that away. And even for me, as someone who was based in the country, there were certain parts that we wanted to visit. We wanted to take the train all the way down to the Indian border. And that provoked all sorts of official paranoia when we started asking for people for permission to do that. And that part of the trip had to be curtailed. So, you know, there's a lot of sort of usual issues of working in Pakistan.
How fun. I was so jealous when I was reading it. And I was just like, who gets to experience this and tell a story like that? It's pretty incredible. Sadia, you have been working on underreported stories, particularly about women. Tell us about your documentary series and the main character that I think we were talking about earlier, and sort of what your goal was in telling her story.
Well, first of all, Azmat, I just want to say thank you for having all of us, and thank you for including documentary filmmakers in the conversation. Which doesn't always happen. So it's really a great pleasure and an honor to be here. I was drawn to the idea of making, my series is called The Other Half of Tomorrow, and it's a series of short vignettes, portraits of dynamic female change makers in Pakistan. So these are educators, activists, performing artists across the country and across a number of different socioeconomic brackets, religions, different sects, speaking different languages in different regions. So the idea was to sort of to give some sense, some small sense of the great depth and breadth of diversity and internal plurality that exists within Pakistan that anyone who has traveled or had the opportunity to live or visit Pakistan will tell you about. But that so rarely, in my experience, the story of that internal diversity is not one that often gets told outside of the country. Most of my work, both as a writer and as a filmmaker, really flows directly out of my family background. I'm the product of a Pakistani-American woman who was raised in Pakistan and a white American father. And what that meant growing up is that I had the tremendous luxury to travel back and forth, to live here. I grew up in the States, in the Boston area, but traveled to Pakistan frequently. And on each one of those trips, I encountered women of my mother's generation. My mother comes from the Muhajir group that Declan mentioned, who traveled to, who made that migration in '47, and came of age she and her generation came of age in this very optimistic time in Pakistan's history in the 60s and 70s. And so we would go to visit Pakistan, and her friends and her colleagues and her cousins were, the women in her world were doing incredible things. These are female politicians, leaders, educators, lawyers, and among many other things. And so, every time I returned to the U.S., I became frustrated that I would tell these stories, and people say, "But that's not. I'm not sure if that's right, actually." And it's amazing what people will tell you, of course, about places that you have that you think you have intimate knowledge of. But that what I found is that the reason that those stories were perhaps hard to hear or didn't make sense to people was that they didn't fit into this larger sort of monolithic narrative about what Pakistan is. Now, when I was growing up in Boston in the 1980s, you had to actually explain to people where Pakistan was, which is now not the case. And I remember as a child saying, "Well, it's the one next to India," And now, of course, it's a very different problem. But so this project, this series of short documentaries, really comes very much, flows directly out of that sort of childhood fascination with these strong, dynamic women that I came to know.
Can you give us an example of one of the women? Because we'd love to watch a little bit of it.
So the series is 12 short films. They range in length between 4 minutes and, say, 15 or 16 minutes. The idea being that we wanted to cover a lot of ground in a short amount of time and to introduce you to women telling their own stories in their own words. One of the pieces that is close to my heart is a portrait of an incredible lady named Rani Shamim. And Rani Shamim is a poet and an educator, self-taught, who lives in the village of Jatri, which is about 2 hours south of Lahore in a district called Nankana Sahib. And she, about 5 or 6 years ago, there were a series of women who were killed by their families in a practice known locally as karokari, or honor killing. And Rani Shamim felt that she wanted to do something about this. She wanted to respond to these murders in some way. And so she began to write songs and poems about these women and about their stories. And she began to perform them at local melas, at local gatherings. And then she began to start leading all of her own initiative women's rights workshops in her district, going village to village. She recruited 3 women in her village, and they set up their own NGO, the 4 of them, and they began to lead these workshops and perform these songs. And so Andreas Burgess, my partner and husband and cinematographer, traveled with me as we followed Rani Shamim and working with the women that she performs and teaches, so that's one example of some of the women who worked on.
I think we have a clip of that, so if we could play it now, that would be great to watch.
छोटे मोटे पहले ते टप्पे या एक आधा जुमला सी फिर आहिस्ता आहिस्ता शौक दे नाल नाल ਇਲਾਕੇ ਦੇ ਅੰਦਰ ਜੋ ਦੇਖਦੀ ਸਾਂ ਦੋ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਦਾ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਫੁਕਦਾਨ ਸੀ ਕਤਲ ਦਾ ਮੁਜਰਮ ਉਹ ਜੋ ਘਰ ਦਾ ਜ਼ਿੰਮੇਦਾਰ ਪਹਿਲੇ ਤੇ ਖੁਦ ਨੂੰ ਹੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਸੀ ਪਤਾ ਕਿ ਔਰਤ ਕੀ ਏ ਔਰਤ ਦੇ ਕੀ ਹਕੂਕ ਨੇ ਔਰਤ ਨੂੰ ਸਾਡੇ ਇਲਾਕੇ ਦੇ ਅੰਦਰ ਸਾਡੇ ਖਾਨਦਾਨ ਦੇ ਅੰਦਰ ਸਾਡੇ ਇਸ ਪਿੰਡ ਦੇ ਅੰਦਰ ਔਰਤ ਨੂੰ ਤੇ ਇਨਸਾਨ ਵੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਸੀ ਸਮਝਿਆ ਜਾਂਦਾ तलीम हासिल जो इंसान कर लेंदा है तो उदों अपने हकूक का भी पता चल जाता है कि साडे हकूक की ने कि साडे की हकूक ने इंसान होने के नाते साडे बहुत सारे हकूक ने औरत नरम दिल कर लैंदी है इतबार औरत नरम दिल कर लैंदी है इतबार कतल दा मुजरम ओ जो घर दा जिम्मेदार कतल दा मुजरम ओ जो घर दा जिम्मेदार करे औरत नू हो कतल फिर थाने जांदे ने करे औरत नू हो कतल फिर थाने जांदे ने हर औरत दे किरदार ते इल्जाम चलांदे ने हर औरत दे किरदार ते इल्जाम चलांदे ने ते मर्द गैरतमंद खबर लग जांदी अखबार ते मर्द गैरतमंद खबर लग जांदी अखबार औरत दी मजलूमी ते जे हैरत नहीं औरत कत्ल करना ये भी गैरत नहीं तशद्दुद रद्द कर गया सब सुन लो पाकिस्तानी तशद्दुद रद्द कर गया सब सुन लो पाकिस्तानी हाँ जी समझ आई
Amazing. It's striking because she's in America. We know of Malala Yousafzai, we know of Benazir Bhutto, but we don't often hear of these changemakers who exist in their communities and are doing incredible things. Tell me what the response to that has been.
It's an interesting question. I mean, I would say, sort of going back to when we first started this project, which was in the winter of 2009, 2010, we began to go to Pakistan to talk about what we wanted to do, and people said, "Oh, absolutely! They're wonderful people, women doing incredible things. There are these 10 women," and I'm sure that many of my eminent panelists have had the same experience, where people will tell you the same 10 people who are doing incredible things, no question. But we said, well, actually, we're really interested in telling maybe some stories that haven't been told before. And we said, we were thinking about, these. And they said, oh, but those stories are so boring. Why would you want to do those stories? And I think that, so there's very different reactions. I mean, I think there are many people, Andreas and I just returned from Pakistan where we had the opportunity. This is one of the films that we had an opportunity to screen a couple of times. And it was enormously gratifying to show the film within Pakistan. And to show, one of those screenings we did was at the Indus Valley School, which is a remarkable art school in Karachi, and the students were incredibly enthusiastic, which was gratifying. But they were also, what was perhaps even more satisfying was how just to see how eager and hungry they were for this kind of content. And they said, "But I didn't know that existed, and you came from outside to tell this story, and I'm from here. I'm from a place that's not too far from there, and I didn't know that was there." And so, again, I think that, unfortunately, as Pakistan gets more difficult and more polarized, even within the country, it gets more difficult to cross some of those social or geographic boundaries that Declan was crossing in the train. That sometimes there's these internal fissures as well that make it difficult to tell some of those stories. So the reaction has been very positive. I would say that the other reaction is that people tell me, how can she say those things? Which I think is a really great question. And I can tell you what she says, which is that, well, I've been saying these things for 10 years, and I'm going to continue to say them. And there were people in her village who gave her tremendous resistance, mostly men in her village who had a real problem with her speaking out. And then she became quite well known in her area for these songs. And then they realized that she was quite useful because when they needed paperwork filled out, that she could do it, and that she had this registered non-governmental organization that could be useful for them for some of their projects. And so there was an interesting reversal that sometimes happens, not always. So
it's very fascinating. And Richard, I've been following your reporting, and one of the ones that was so interesting to me was it was a profile of a man who has been accused by the U.S. of plotting as the mastermind of the 2008 Mumbai terror attacks. And his name is Hafiz Mohammed Saeed, and Western media outlets have covered him over and over. They've profiled him, but a piece you wrote looked at him through a different lens. It was kind of like a tale of two brothers. Can you tell us a little bit about that report and sort of what your motivations were in telling it that way?
Anybody who's had editors will know that when an editor gets in their mind that they want a story, they're going to keep coming at you. Where's that Hafiz Saeed story? You know, the guy with the $10 million bounty on his head in Lahore. And I kept thinking about it, and I thought, well, I can't write anything different. Okay, he doesn't really talk. He rants against the Jews, the Americans, and the Indians, you know. Well, I always put it in the context of the Jews, the Christians, and the Hindus. And that's his job. That's all he does. That's how he raises money for this group that he heads. And behind this group, a charitable group, is Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is a terrorist group. So when I went to Lahore one time to get a story, I met a young man who desperately wanted to be a journalist. And he was in the madrasa with Saeed's group. And he said, and I said, well, are you going to stay in this? He said, well, I don't know. I really don't want to, but I'll help you out. He said, I know his brother, Hafiz Saeed's brother, Hafiz Masood. And he says, I'll have you meet him. So Hafiz Masood spent 21 years in America, living in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood, and was well educated in American ways. I mean, when I talked to the guy, he was using, you know, like colloquialisms, like, you know, yeah, you know, you go, you know, I can't remember them off the top of my head. But anyway, so I'm here, I'm thinking, well, this is a good way to tell the story of how did one brother get this way and how did the other brother get this way. So a study in contrast. So it didn't turn out so much to be a profile of Hafiz Saeed, the terrorist, alleged terrorist. It turned out to be an intermingling of you know, where ideas come from, because the very subdued brother who grew up in America had measured things to say about America. He enjoyed the munificence of America. He ran a mosque in a Boston suburb, but he was eventually deported on a very minor visa violation, and his life in America ended. And what was he to do? He had Pakistan now. So he went to his brother's madrasa, and the brother, Hafiz Saeed, gave him a job, basically as you know, a communications coordinator kind of thing. And he left his 8 children and his wife back in Boston. None of them wanted to come to Pakistan. I mean, no offense, why would they? You know, they had lives in America, they were educated in America, and they said, you know, we're Americans now. So it was kind of bittersweet, too, because now he's left his entire family. So what he did was he married a Pakistani woman, and he started a new family. And he told me, I'm starting over again. My material life is done. What I have left now is to work for God. And I found that profound, because he was working for God on a level that I don't think his brother was. I think his brother was an agitator and actually a nasty piece of work, in that he was implicated in killing 260 people, you know. But I think, you know, the way to tell stories, like, you know, Declan points out, or you both point out, is through people. And Americans don't understand that Pakistan isn't just a geographic, you know, tinderbox, or however we describe it with cliches, but a nation of people. And whenever I could get out of Islamabad and get to places where people were, I was the happiest. It's an amazing and terrifying place. But it's unlike any in the world that I've ever been, and really appreciate the fact that I got to work there.
Did you have any challenges in trying to tell the story that you were just talking about Hafiz Saeed and his brother? Did you find any obstacles from the state or people who, I mean, he's obviously a very contentious, this man
Right.
is a serious geopolitical source of drama between the United States and Pakistan. The U.S. has announced, you know, a $10 million reward for any assistance in his prosecution and sentencing. Did you have any trouble getting access to this brother or to him? Or tell us a little bit about that.
No trouble with access because he's protected by the ISI. So, I mean, he's a terrorist. Why wouldn't they protect him? Or an alleged terrorist, I'm sorry. I mean, I should probably not be so, I'm not going back anytime soon. So there was no problem. I mean, I just went and, you know, and waited and, you know, I didn't talk to Hafiz Saeed. I just listened to his sermon, which was, you know, a wind-up kind of sermon, that everything was America's, you know, fault, and again, the conspiracies that are endless. So there was no problem with that. And other times I have had access problems, but minor compared to, you know, I'm sure what you guys have had. We were taken by the military to the village, Mingora, the village where Malala was shot. We were under armed guard, armed, you know, machine gunners following us everywhere. And the great irony of that visit was that they kept insisting that the region was totally safe. And, but whatever you do, don't walk over there. But that was, you know, they tried to block our coverage when we went to Malala's school, but all you had to do, they were so utterly incompetent that all you had to do was just go around the back and talk to the principal and get your reporting done there. Never had real trouble, you know, with security forces, because I think they knew all the time what the Washington Post was doing. That's their job.
Declan, I know that a few years ago, you reported a story that other reporters I know from Pakistan had lamented later, saying, darn it, Declan did that story, now no one can go to Balochistan, the largest province in Pakistan, and you had this amazing magazine piece in The Guardian about the secret war that the state was carrying out there. Tell us a little bit about that story, why you wanted to tell it, and the challenges you had in getting access or reaching an area where so few journalists, let alone foreign correspondents, get to tell stories from.
Yeah, it was actually called The Secret Dirty War, was what we called it. That was the headline. I've been interested in Balochistan since I got to Pakistan. One of the first trips I did, actually, was I flew to Quetta and I went to the very western part of the province to see this tribal leader at the time, who was called Nawab Akbar Khan Bukti, who was this incredibly sort of colourful tribal leader who you know, lived in the far reaches of Balochistan in a mud fort, was surrounded by all of these gunmen who looked like something out of a Victorian sort of play, with sort of twirly moustaches and decorated guns. And he was this man who considered himself to be a great intellectual, and would hold forth you know, about Sartre and Dostoevsky and, you know, Greek philosophy and these sort of things. And when I was there, he was giving an English lesson to you know, the tribal chiefs who'd come from the surrounding area. So he's this incredibly eccentric man who subsequently became a very consequential figure in Balochistan, because he was his area is in a part of Balochistan which is the source of much of the natural gas in the country. The state had been exploiting this natural gas in a place called Sui for decades. And at the time I was there was suddenly this agitation, there was a row about the payment of money, and then it got violent about the time I was there, and subsequently Nawab Bukti was killed by the army in a rather dramatic operation close by. It's not entirely clear what happened, but one version is that a helicopter fired a rocket into the cave where he was hiding, and he was killed. He became a martyr, and all of a sudden the Baloch nationalist sort of movement took off with renewed vigor. And this insurgency started, sort of a low-level insurgency, which continues today. So that was where my interest stemmed from, in that I'd sort of seen it at a fairly early, this latest iteration of the Baloch insurgency I'd seen, and I'd kind of had an interest in it. And then it became clear to me that, this is this story that has had very little Western press attention, partly because over the last decade it has hit very few of the narrative buttons that make Pakistan interesting for us. So there was no real Taliban angle, there's no nuclear angle, there's a violence angle in that there's an insurgency going on, but it's not connected to the familiar kind of tropes that that we associate with Pakistan. So it wasn't getting a lot of Western attention, and it wasn't getting a lot of Pakistani attention, because it is this incredibly sensitive issue for the Pakistani military in particular, because they see the Baloch insurgency. I think there's a sort of ethnic superiority issue with the Baloch, who are seen as these people who never really were supporting Pakistan from the beginning, and now they're these sort of upstarts who have risen up again, and they're making trouble for us, and we wish they would just, get out of the way. So, and the other thing is the army sees this as something that's been sponsored by India, which is, of course, the great sort of, sensitive thing in Pakistan. So there was, consequently of that, there was very little coverage of this story of the insurgency in the Pakistani press, and in particular of human rights abuses by the Pakistan military, because it became clear from my friends who were in Balochistan were telling me that there was this what they call a kill and dump policy going on, where people who were perceived to be associated with this insurgency were being picked up by the security forces, various wings of it, and sort of were disappearing and would be held incommunicado for months on end, and then frequently or periodically, and then it became more frequent, the bodies of people would turn up on the side of the road. So to get to your question, when I went to do this story, which I guess was maybe 4 years ago now, I wanted to find some of these people who had, whose relatives had been killed, who were involved with the Baloch nationalist movement, and to tell that story, because I just felt it was something I hadn't really read much about. And then I went to Quetta with some difficulty, met people there, met people outside of Balochistan as well, and pulled that all together into a narrative.
Was it hard to go back? Did you have any penalties after publishing the story? Was there? No,
certainly it got quite a lot of attention at the time, and as often is the case with the Pakistani press, which is full of great journalists, but sometimes it takes a foreign news outlet to report on a sensitive subject, and then that's seen as a sort of green light for the local guys to do it, sometimes because they're worried about about being victimized by the security forces. Mm-hmm. On certain topics, I find the Pakistani journalists will sort of wait for it, and then they'll say, oh, the Guardian or the New York Times or the Washington Post reported this, and then it sort of sets off their own chain of reporting. So it certainly got quite a lot of attention, and I think, obviously there were people in the security forces that didn't appreciate it, but I mean, I did go to them in the reporting of it, and I met the head of the Frontier Corps, which is the main kind of military organization in Balochistan, and I spoke to them. So, I'd certainly gone out of my way to try and make sure that they had a voice in the piece, which I felt was important because of the gravity of the allegations that were being made by the people. Because not only did they, I sort of went to this safe house in Quetta where they brought people, sort of old women, old men, brothers, sons, who told me the stories about their relatives who had kind of just vanished in the night. Sometimes they're oftentimes vanished at checkposts. Mm-hmm. And then they would produce these photographs, or they would pull out their phones and show me a video of a corpse. There's a lot of this rather sort of ghoulish, but it's kind of a mark of the desperation of these people, that they take photographs of the corpses of people and put them out on the internet to show what's happened to them while when the bodies were recovered. So it's tough stuff to look at, but it's kind of, I think, a mark of the desperation of these people that they want to get it out. And even now, if you're in Pakistan, there's quite a lot of websites that are associated with the Baloch insurgency, which are not accessible, which are blocked by the government's sort of internet filtering.
Fascinating. You were kicked out of the country in May. Tell us a little bit about what happened, sort of your experiences with that, and those of some of your other colleagues, including Pakistanis, who've had issues with the state or others threatening or intimidating them. What happened in your situation?
Well, it was about 3 days before the election. I went round to a friend's house, a friend who's actually here tonight, and we were having a drink, talking about the elections that were coming. There was a lot of gossip about, what was going to happen. And I got a call from a sort of number I didn't recognise, and it was some rather gruff guy on the phone who told me I had to come home immediately. And I said, why? And he said, well, we're the police. So anyway, I seem to remember actually finishing my drink and eventually getting in the car and going home. And when we got to the gate, there was a van outside with a bunch of police officers in it, and then there was a number of plainclothes people as well. One guy came forward. He had a letter. In the best traditions of Pakistani bureaucracy, he asked me to sign for the letter, which I did. And then I read it, and it was very short. It just said, dear Mr. Walsh, this is to inform you that your visa has been cancelled with immediate effect on account of your undesirable activities, which I hoped was a reflection on my journalism, nothing else. And you've got 72 hours to leave the country. So, I remember taking this letter and reading it and going into the house and thinking, oh, God, this is going to be a headache. Because I thought, okay, I'd already had some difficulty with renewing a visa, and I thought this was just going to be something that I would have to make a lot of calls about and fix. Because, as everyone here knows, in Pakistan, you can get a lot done just by knowing people and talking, and often things can go forward and be reversed and so on. So I was sort of initially working on the assumption that I'd be able to get, to sort of appeal to better reason and try and undo this. And I spent the first 48 hours trying to get this undone on the phone, calling in. I'd been in Pakistan for almost 9 years at that point, so basically calling in 9 years worth of, favors and contacts, like beating the phone. And still at the end of it, basically came to the conclusion that this wasn't going to get undone. So then on the third day, I went to Lahore to report on this was all happening, obviously, in parallel with the election campaign, which was the real news. So on the third day, which was the day of polling, I went to Lahore, reported on the election down there, and went to an Imran Khan sort of impromptu rally that had erupted outside a polling station in Lahore, and went to see the Nawaz side and had quite a good time. And then was on my way back to the hotel, and a number of things happened, which I won't sort of bore you with the fine details, but basically I ended up getting picked up at a checkpost, went to a friend's house, these people came to the house, intelligence people, and told me that I was going to have to go with them, and eventually ended up being put under a form of house arrest at a hotel for 8 or 10 hours, until I was sort of driven to the airport with a sort of escort, which was an honour, and then I was gone.
Did you know why at the time? Was there a story, or was there something, or what's behind it? And do you still know? Have you found out since then?
No, this is the frustrating thing. This is the question that we have been, as a newspaper, I've been asking Pakistan authorities since, which is really just to have a more thorough explanation of what the problem was. There have been sort of leaked stories in the local press, and particularly in the Urdu media, about sort of, espionage and things like that, sort of nonsense. And then there have been sort of more serious documents that have been circulated from the government, sort of to local journalists, basically saying that I've sort of broke rules, and there was a trip I took to Quetta, as I said, Balochistan is a sensitive thing. There was some mention of that. But we've really had very few, sort of a frustrating lack of specifics about what the problem was. So that's still where we are. But just in relation to your previous question, I think it's important to say that, for whatever happened to me, it's really, very soft treatment, if you can call it that, compared to what happens to local journalists, as we had the Michael, who mentioned at the outset, there was an excellent report by the Committee to Protect Journalists last year that focused on a number of cases of 3 or 4 journalists who've been killed in the course of their work in Pakistan. And it's really those guys who, take incredible risks to try and tell stories to their own people about what's going on. And you have to have the greatest respect for them. I mean, with the notable exception of Daniel Pearl, who of course died in terrible circumstances in Pakistan in 2002. But generally, with foreign reporters, we do have difficulties of having a lot of restrictions about where you can go. The security services are keeping a close eye on you. This whole issue of visas is something that people within the government who want to restrict reporting can use. But thankfully, it's not as serious as the sort of issues that some local reporters have faced, some of whom have paid the biggest price.
What's your message for Pakistan? I know you're trying to get back into the country. What would you tell the people, whomever it is, that said, make him leave? What would you say to them?
The same thing I've always said, really, which is just that, without getting involved in pleading my own case, but I think in general terms, for a country that suffers often as much bad press as Pakistan does, and particularly in this country, I think it's often presented in a very obviously in a very negative light, and sometimes in quite a fearful light. I think from the perspective of the Pakistani authorities, who are the ones who are making these decisions, it's always best to have people in your country who both have hopefully a fairly detailed understanding of the country and how it works, and also have a feeling for it, and who have a sympathy with its people. I think what the authorities in Pakistan often, and many governments actually, fail to distinguish between is legitimate criticism of the policies of the state or the military or whatever, but a sense of empathy or sympathy with the people of the country and their welfare and progress. And I think that any journalist who spends time in a country inevitably develops that sort of sense of sympathy with the people. And I hope, in my case, certainly having lived there for 9 years, that I did develop. I came to Pakistan knowing very little about the country, very little when I think back, actually. I wasn't even that enthusiastic about it in the beginning, I remember. And then, because I covered Pakistan and Afghanistan for the first number of years I was there, and I remember I used to think Kabul was much more exciting and vibrant, and I found the Afghans were kind of a bit more charming, and I lived in Islamabad, which was this, deadly dull city at the time. Nothing was going on. People used to make jokes about, they would say, there were 2 standard jokes that you still hear now. One is, the amazing thing about Islamabad is that it's only 15 miles from Pakistan. And then the other one they used to say was Islamabad, half the size of a New York graveyard and twice as dead. So, Islamabad was, I remember I just really was not into it in the beginning. But then I, really got into the whole Pakistan story. I made friends. I discovered what an amazing, kind of messed up, but also, kind of seductive country it was. And I think for any reporter who, gets into a country that much, you really start to, I think it reflects probably in your reporting as well.
Absolutely. And Habiba, I know we're going to open it up to questions in just a little bit, but Habiba, you have equally really interesting stories from the country, everything from, underreported, how incest survivors get help and how they seek justice, but also the film that I mentioned earlier in introducing you about what it's, Americans, they hear about rape, they hear about gang rape, but when it comes down to understanding the nitty-gritty of the justice system and what happens when a woman makes an accusation like that or comes forward about a case, it's really one of the most in-depth looks to date, I think, that I've seen about what happens. Can you tell us a little bit about what motivated that story and the reporting process behind it?
Yeah, sure. It was a very tough story to report because as a reporter, you're sort of, documents are your friends. Sometimes people say this or they say that, but really looking at court documents, looking at evidence, they're looking at investigation reports by the police, you're able to come up with a pretty clear picture of what happened in a situation. But when in a case like Pakistan, where when a woman says that she's been raped, without the support of the police to investigate properly, what ends up happening when the woman does have, you know, the guts to take a case to court is it's his word against her. And that's hard to win in any country because you just don't have the evidence. I mean, the men in this case were up against the death penalty. So it's not a case that the courts take lightly. And when you don't have the mechanisms in place to sort of help a rape victim or help an alleged rape victim compile her evidence in a timely manner, you're going to end up with a system that's just really messed up. And that's what happened in this case. So we don't, I mean, I spent almost 5 years reporting this, and at the end, we still don't know what happened. And partly, you know, that was frustrating for us because we had embarked on this case and we were going to look at this, and at the end, we would know what happened. But, you know, 5 years later, I still can't tell you what really happened. But what we ended up making a film about then was the process. What does it take to fight a rape case in Pakistan? And we were very determined to not just get the side of the alleged victim, but also of the 4 men who were accused. Because when you have a system, a criminal justice system that doesn't work, it's not only, I think, detrimental to the woman who's trying to get justice, but it's also detrimental to the families and the men if they have been accused, you know, wrongly. It drags on for years and becomes deadly, where you end up, you know, with family feuds where they end up killing each other. And that's what happened in this case. And, you know, during the trial, shortly after the men were released, Kainat's brother ends up dead. You know, the police did a brief investigation and they found they had to close the case 4 months later due to the lack of evidence. And that's that. So, you know, what we saw that what we could do was highlight sort of the difficulties of what exactly does it take to take a case to the Pakistani court. And you know, one of the frustrating parts for me was I got a hold of the investigative reporter who did the initial report. First, when she went to the court, when she went to the police to report the rape, they were told they wouldn't lodge a complaint, and that's very common in Pakistan. You have to like pull favors to get a initial report written. Can't tell you why. It just is what it is, you know. So it took 3 days or so before the initial report was even lodged, and then I think the rape kit or a version of it was done, you know, another couple of days later. And by that time, the crucial evidence in a rape case is sort of not there. So I talked to the investigative officer and I said, you know, can you walk me through the process that you took to investigate this rape? And he said, sure. You know, I mean, he didn't want to be in the film, but he said, yeah, it was really easy, you know. And I was like, oh, really? He said, yeah, you know, I can just tell if a woman is lying. And when she walked in, I knew she was lying. So that was pretty easy for me. And I was like, okay. And he was up for a promotion, so he didn't want to be in the film in case it would hurt his chances. But, you know, that's the kind of system that I think a lot of women are up against. Whether she was raped or not, she deserves a fair chance in court, and you just don't get that. I mean, there was a recent report by the Pakistani government that said that in the last year or so, every case that has gone to, in Islamabad, that have gone to the courts, there have been 0 convictions in rape cases. And that's because there's just the system is not set up to investigate that when it does end up in the courts, that you have proper evidence that can support or not support the woman's story. But, you know, I was talking to Azmat earlier, you know, the Woody Allen sort of, there's so many similarities between the Kainat Sumro case and the Woody Allen, you know, issue that's been debate. It's a good way to put it. And, you know, it's just it's frustrating as journalists to tell those stories. But I think it's important because it shows a deeper sort of problem within the system. It's, you know, and I think some people who watched the film were frustrated with me that I didn't side in a particular way with Kainat, or, I mean, I think I was fair to everybody, but, you know, you do meet the men who were accused, and we follow them for 4 years as well, and we tell their story as well. And I think people, you know, wanted a more sympathetic film towards Kainat, and I don't think it would have been journalistically appropriate to do that. And that's been an interesting insight that, people felt frustrated that the men were given space, not necessarily, they shouldn't have been in the film. Some people have pointed out. So.
We have a clip from the film to show, so if we could just play that quickly so people can get a sense.
मैं स्कूल गई तो वापसी घर में आई, फिर उसने मेरे साथ ज़्यादती की, 3 लोग थे, फिर जहाँ पर वो चौथा आदमी था उसने मेरे साथ ज़्यादती की। सर हम चाहते हैं कि हमारे साथ कोर्ट चले, उनको हम बंद करवाते हैं।
बाबा हिन शहबान रेप किया, एहसान किया, कली मुलात रोशन
सही किरदार जी हुजे हा त वरी हाई कोर्ट में अपीलूं न करे हा, इन जो कूड़ साबित थी वियो त चुप करे घर वेहणु खपे हा, उनखे पंहिंजो मुड़ुस करणु खपे हा। सही न आहे काइनात, काइनात सही न आहे।
She is destined to be killed because she is impure now.
मेरा भाई गया है, खुदा ने कहा कल मेरा बात जाएगा, फिर किसको कहेंगे, हम
जंग लहण हलिया आहियूं, असां उहा जंग जॾहिं हुननि खे असां दुश्मननि खे ख़तमु कराए ऐं पोइ असां जेको वापसि ईंदासीं।
One last question before we take questions from the audience, but watching this, it's 2 female filmmakers, you and Hilke Schellman, in the country on and off for 4 years. What sort of problems and obstacles did you encounter, and in what ways maybe was your gender an advantage in your reporting at times?
Yeah, I think despite what people often say, I think Pakistan is one of the easiest places to report in some ways, because everybody wants to talk to you. People are so friendly. I mean, people are like, how hard was it to get the men to talk to you? And I was like, actually, it was really easy. We showed up and we said, we want to hear your story. And they said, finally, somebody came to hear my story. Let me tell you what I have to say. So that part is great, especially, I think, being a woman. Nobody's scared of me. And they will tell me anything that's on their mind. And they'll be like, yeah, and then you should talk to my mom, and she thinks this. And so it's a really amazing place to report, for those reasons, that people are just friendly. They want to talk. They are not, I don't think they're shy of the media. And I think people also have a kind of like this Bollywood fascination. They want to be in films. So, I try to explain this as documentary, but whatever, they were all for it. So that was really easy. But, there are restrictions as well. I am Pakistani. I'm a freelancer, which comes with, there are some things that are easier for me because, I don't get labeled as, you represent the New York Times or Washington Post, so you must have this view. So it's easier for me to navigate. But it's also difficult because, I have to think about my safety. I'm on my own in different ways. And I'm also, being Pakistani, people have a lot of, strange expectations. I mean, every conversation ends up with, are you married? Where's your kid? You left him and came here? Those kinds of questions you're constantly answering. And they're like, during the filming of it, I didn't have kids, and that was really a big scandal. So, people were always like, at the end of every interview, they would be like, you should really consider, stopping this and going to have some kids. And I was like, I'll take that into consideration. So those, my days were pretty much, nobody wakes up in Pakistan early. That just, 11 is probably the earliest. I think you can get an interview with somebody. So, I would never shoot in the dark. I would never be able to work after like 5 o'clock, because I know I'm a woman, and because I know that, I have to be aware of those things. There are places I didn't feel comfortable traveling. One of the really cool tricks that I quickly learned was, I would get a car, just a normal rental car, and I would ask the driver not to wear his uniform. So he would accompany me to all the shoots, and he would just look like a family member or something. And because I was with a guy, people would just leave me alone. And at first it was really hard to convince the drivers not to wear the uniform, because they'd be like, no, miss, I'll get in trouble. I was like, please stop wearing, because for me, it was the more I can blend in, the better it is, and the easier it is for me. I didn't want to stand out, and so that was my cheap way of affording protection of some kind. But I remember I was telling Azmat this, that the first time we were going to meet with Kainat, it was through the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan, and I was staying with my family because we couldn't afford anything, so we just usually stay with family as a freelancer. So they asked where we were going, and we said, oh, we're going to Sadr, and it's really like going to Harlem, and it's not that bad, And they were like, oh my God, you're leaving defense? And they were just totally freaked out that we're leaving this like posh neighborhood that they lived in and going off to talk to some normal people, right? And I just was like looking at my colleague who were both staying there, and I was just like, well, I have no idea what's going on. They're like, you can't go. And we're like, what do you mean we can't go? And they're like, okay, you can go, but we have to come with you. So they all, my father-in-law, my husband, and my and his aunt, they all just got in a car and they showed up. And and the people at Human Rights Commission of Pakistan, they were actually like totally like, oh yeah, this happens all the time. You sit there and we'll go in the other room and interview. I was so mortified, and after that, I never tell any family members where I'm going because I know it'll totally freak them out. But those are, as a Pakistani and as a journalist, those are the two worlds, I've had to constantly negotiate. My family being completely terrified of the fact that I am a journalist and they're just trying to protect me. But at the same time, it's sort of like you need to, be left alone to do your job. So after that, I only say I'm staying in defense because that will just, as long as I'm having a cappuccino somewhere, they're fine. But
So we want to open this up to questions. There's a microphone in the center of the room, so feel free to approach the microphone and ask a question. I know that there are a lot of aspiring journalists in the audience and others who are veteran journalists, but
Hi, my name is Malik Sadia Shepard. I'm a Pakistani journalist working for the Baloch Hall, which is a newspaper focusing on Balochistan region. My question is to Declan. You worked previously for The Guardian, then you worked for the New York Times. What does the relationship, the troubled relationship of Pakistani government with the U.S., does it have anything to do with the hostility towards Western journalists? So like at times organizations like Al Jazeera cover Pakistan and they get away with it. But then we have this entire story of like, the kidnapping of Daniel Pearl, for instance, then troubles with you. Was that because you worked for the New York Times, or did that have anything else to do with yourself as a journalist? Is it like if you work for a US publication, the risks are higher? Thank you.
I mean, certainly in the case of Daniel Pearl, I don't think there's any doubt that he was targeted, at least in part, because of, it was a particularly fraught time, obviously, in the aftermath of 2001 and the attacks and then the American operations in Afghanistan. In my particular case, probably. I don't know is the answer. I mean, I've only worked for one British paper and now one American one. But certainly, when you, because relations between Pakistan and the US have been particularly fraught. I mean, more than fraught, just disastrous in the last three years in particular. I guess, for prominent papers, particularly like the Times, certainly Pakistani officials are very sensitive to what's written because they're sensitive about their relationship with America, and people have sometimes slightly exaggerated notions about, they think that the New York Times takes its cues from the State Department and so on, which when you say that here sounds really strange, but in Pakistan people have this assumption often. So that may have played a role, certainly.
I just want to point out that the man who asked that question, Malik Siraj Akbar, launched the very first online news site covering Balochistan, and that it's called the Baloch Hall. You can find it if you click the reporting POC hashtag. I think I've tweeted it, or it's scheduled to go out sometime during this hour, so you should be able to find that as well. But the website, from my understanding, in Pakistan has been banned in the country since 2010. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I am Dr. Nisar Chaudhry with the Pakistan-American League. It's really incredible that this team went so deep into the side arteries and remote areas and retrieved stories which otherwise should have not been surfaced. And for this matter, I really must congratulate you for this. But on the other hand, as Welsh was mentioning, came with a paper to sign. Are you sure that they asked you to sign or give them your autograph? Are you sure about that?
That's really fun.
And my question is, what went wrong with Pakistan? Could any one of you tell us?
Now we only have a few more minutes, so maybe you can narrow that question
This
a
was
little
the
bit.
country, first Muslim country in the recorded history, who elected women democratically as the prime minister or head of state. And then she was elected twice. Mullahs had no place. Nobody heard them. There were mullahs who passed fatwas that women cannot be head of state, but she was head of state. So when something went wrong, and where something went wrong, and in your case, have you ever thought in retrospect yourself, okay, what could be the probable reason? And do you know other foreign journalists like you, how many of them have been expelled or asked to leave? Do you have some other examples? That's very important to know. And you should also try to tell us, or think about it. You mentioned about visa problem. What was that visa problem? You thought this might be the reason. Thank you.
So this is for me. So, well, I would say.
What went wrong? What wrong the whole country?
Well, there were problems from the beginning, but I mean, it seems to me that right now the biggest, if we sort of shift it to what's going on at the moment, obviously the biggest. I mean, a lot of things. I've been covering Pakistan for almost a decade, and a lot of things have changed in that time since I arrived in Islamabad and thought it was deadly dull, and then suddenly it actually got very interesting, and often in not very positive ways. But it's clear that right now it's a very interesting time because we have this idea that the government is engaged in some form of negotiation with the Pakistani Taliban to try and end the insurgency, which is really an unprecedented thing in the history of Pakistan. Previously when insurgent groups have risen, if you go back to the East Pakistan War in 1971 that resulted in the creation of Bangladesh, or the various Baloch uprisings, the state has responded with maximum prejudice, actually. And now we have this really formidable challenge to the authority of the Pakistani state. We've had years of suicide bombings. I mean, before we came out, I was sort of trying to think through, or even looking through my clips of stories I've written about bombings and atrocities. I mean, it's a list as long as your arm. It's terrible. And now we have this business that the government is responding to this challenge, the state is responding to this challenge through some form of negotiation. Now, it might just be the prelude to a military operation in the tribal belt, but it is really quite a thing, and I think could be an important inflection point in Pakistan's future trajectory. Yeah.
And also, if we could just keep our questions to maybe half a minute or not too long. Go ahead, please.
Do you want to just start the clock now, or?
Go.
Well, my name's Tyler Boyce. I'm a student at the University of San Diego, although I'm here in D.C. with the Washington Center internship program. And my question is, I covered a lot about Pakistan in my national security class, and we hear a lot about Pakistani relations with the U.S. in the news, whether it be with the Pakistani Taliban or with drone strikes, but we never really hear, when you're talking about underreported events, about Pakistan's relation with other countries, like with Iran, with Afghanistan, with China, particularly China, just because of the massive economic and military presence it has in Pakistan. So I'm not really sure who could answer this, but what are your thoughts on that? Have you covered any stories like that in the past?
I can tell you they don't like India.
Well, I think there's an interesting story in Balochistan, right? Like there's a port, and China has invested heavily. I don't know if that's been a story for any of you.
I did a piece on the proposed natural gas or pipeline, natural gas or oil, I think, from Iran to Pakistan. It was always, I mean, literally a pipe dream, though. It wasn't going to happen. I covered the summit of Ahmadinejad, Karzai, and which president was in? Zardari. Didn't seem to me that much got done except posturing. Maybe that's the nature of summits. But you're right, there should be more coverage of the relationship with China. We covered also the small bursts of comity between India and Pakistan on visas, trade, things like that. But they tended to get gummed up when because the military didn't want things to go too close, too much cooperation. Why? Because in my view, the entire military industrial complex in Pakistan depends on keeping a conspiratorial view and amped up hatred of India. That justifies their massive budgets. And you want to know what went wrong with Pakistan. If you look at social spending, okay, so many families push their children into the madrasas because they can't afford school, or they're illiterate to begin with. The state is filled with kleptocrats who continue to basically steal money. And there's, I don't know, I might have met 3 altruists in the entire time I was there.
Really?
Yeah. You met more? I'm sorry, that's negative, but then what happens? The Saudis come in, fund the madrasas, and you have what you call the Talibanization of the country. Now, I wasn't there long enough to make sure this is a tried and true theory, but I throw it out that that's among the problems,
I mean, if I could, I would absolutely agree that military spending since the creation of Pakistan in '47 has been certainly outsized. But I think in my work, I was really fortunate to cross the length and breadth of as much of Pakistan as I could. I was not able to travel to Balochistan. I did some work in Swat. But so obviously, this is just certain sections. But still, I was tremendously impressed to be able to meet true altruistic souls. Some of which, and again, I think some of those stories are harder to tell because they're not tied to a news peg. They're not nimble to the curve, as you mentioned, Azmat. But I think that I think Pakistan will surprise you, and I'm sure we can agree on that. That they're tremendous. The people of Pakistan are. I think one of the greatest challenges that I found in my documentary practice within Pakistan was that that people are very eager to be on camera, but no one will tell you no. And so it's such a hospitable culture that when you ask, and may I come to your home tomorrow? Even if it would be absolutely verboten for you to set foot inside that person's home for whatever social mores you may be crisscrossing, no one's going to tell you not to. They say, of course, we would love for you to come. And then perhaps something might pop up the next day and you can't come. And I'm sure you've had that same experience. But so I have found not just hospitality but also true altruism.
No, I definitely agree with the hospitality. On an individual level, I meant sort of at the higher government level. There are people doing social works there that's very impressive. But I don't know about the top government layers per se, from my perspective.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to move on to the next question, but thank you.
Cynthia Schneider, Georgetown University. Thank you for such an interesting panel. I want to ask you about another untold story, maybe a surprising aspect of Pakistan, and that's something I've been able to learn about from Sadia and her late mother, Samina Qureshi, and Jahid Nadim here, and that's the thriving cultural scene in Pakistan. How is it that you have this country with just brilliant music, incredible visual arts, and of course where poetry, Iqbal's as important as Jinnah, poetry, literature, you just had tens of thousands of people at the Karachi Literature Festival. How do you square that circle? And is it encouraging? Can we take hope from this new Sindh festival that Bilawar Bhutto is premiering on the national stage with? And how does that jibe with all of the political problems?
Bilal tweeted this event, by the way. for whatever it's worth.
Oh, he did? Really?
He did. Bilal, thank you for tweeting us.
Yes.
And we wish you the best with your festival. We really do. I applaud his efforts, and I think it's very exciting what he's doing. I am, of course, one of the people, and I learned about some of this activity from Declan's own Twitter feed. But I'm certainly among those who were dismayed that the stage and a laser light show were happening on the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, one of the oldest civilizations in recorded history. But with that said, I think it is an exciting time in the cultural sphere in Pakistan, and I think that I know that I take great hope and comfort and inspiration from the vibrancy of Pakistan's cultural and arts, in the performing arts particularly, footprint right now. I mean, as you mentioned, the Karachi Literature Festival is going strong and getting bigger and bigger each year. And I think Declan has spoken there several times. I've had the opportunity to speak there twice, and each time that I have been there, I've been struck by not just the crowds. There's just some 60,000 people attending a festival to hear novelists and poets. And not just talk in English, but to speak in many, in a diverse number of regional languages as well. But you're also finding this is an incredibly diverse audience. These are not just the English-speaking elite that are coming in to hear these authors. And the Karachi Literature Festival there's now a Lahore Literature Festival, and there's talk of other literature festivals that are starting. There's a visual arts festival going on right now. There's a festival coming to Karachi in March, which will 24 different plays, I believe, are going to be performed.
And the music coming out of Coke Studio, I think, has been.
And it's a very exciting time for music in Pakistan.
I'm totally in love with it.
Yeah. So I think that it is a. I mean, if you look throughout history, of course, that in times of great friction. There is sometimes there are these forces that are rubbing up against each other, and that I think that's what you're seeing, and a tremendous creative output ensues. And I know that I'm seeing that. And again, in my documentary work in Pakistan, I've had the opportunity to work with some of those performing artists and get to know them. One of them, Shima Kermani, is a pioneering educator and activist and performing arts dancer. The public performance of dance has been outlawed in Pakistan since 1981, but Shima Kermani continues to perform and is not only that, but not only continues to perform and to teach young dancers, but is actually, people are incredibly proud of Shima's work and will often cite her as this incredible example. Zaib and Hanya are two popular musicians in Lahore and Islamabad who have sprung to popularity, of course, through some of the incredible programs at Coke Studio, which I encourage you to all check out. But so you're finding that even though it can be difficult because of security concerns within Pakistan to have performing arts exist in the open light of day, and that's one of the reasons we should applaud the Sindh Festival, that still you're finding this happening at all levels of society. So I know that I take great comfort in that. Thank you for the question.
Sir?
Hi, my name is Marco Di Capo. I served as a diplomat in the Indian subcontinent for about 5 years. And thank you so much for being here tonight and actually telling us about the challenges of developing a Pakistani narrative at the moment. The question that I have is, was it ever easy to develop a Pakistani narrative? Or if not, why not?
I think there are multiple Pakistani narratives, or at least there should be. I think there should be multiple Pakistani narratives because, someone actually once said to me, and I think it really made sense, like, in Pakistan, you can coexist with your neighbor in completely different decades. Like, they're in 2013 and you're still in, like, 1960. And I think that there's just so much diversity in Pakistan, and that I would be wary of a single narrative about what Pakistan is and what it should be.
I think there are, as Habiba was saying, it's the incredible thing about Pakistan that people, especially if you haven't been and you go and you're like, how can all of these things coexist side by side? And even in reporting about women's issues, I mean, it is incredible. Like you say, on the one hand, the most awful things happen to women. On the other hand, you go there and you see lots of women who are doing amazing things and enjoy a sort of social freedoms you wouldn't exist. But to go to your question, you know, in the kind of broad sweep of Pakistan's narrative as a country, I think there is a problem that stems from the beginning, an identity issue that came from, you know, the circumstances in which the country was born and the relationship between the state and Islam. And I think that what we're seeing at the moment is actually the product of that it has now come, not exactly full circle, but we are the product now with the Pakistani Taliban, and the challenge that is making to the state is a product of an identity crisis that has been manipulated by various leaders over the years for their own purposes, from Zia-ul-Haq in the 1980s, who engaged in a very fierce program of Islamization, which is still evident in the mindsets of prominent people, particularly in the Pakistani media at the moment. Even Zulfikar Bhutto, who was ostensibly a liberal prime minister, but who you know, made concessions to right-wing conservatives in order to shore up his own support in the 1970s, did things like the banning or reducing the status of the Ahmadis and so on. So I think there has been a sort of an abuse by the country's leaders of this identity crisis from the beginning, because it's been a very nebulous thing. And, you know, without kind of going into a long sort of, you know, my theories on this, I think that what you see at the moment is, at a narrative level, a product of that confused narrative.
I think that for the next questions, maybe we could have the next three of you just go in succession, and then the panel will take the questions.
Great, thank you. My name is Matthew Estrada from the American Foreign Service Association. And my question has to do with the interaction between foreign journalists and local journalists, and the English-speaking press and the Urdu-speaking press. Declan, you mentioned a little bit about how sometimes international stories and journalists can give space to local journalists to start reporting on things. But how is the interaction the other way around? Like, what things have you taken away from maybe the local journalists or the Urdu-speaking press? How does that come in and influence your work, the relationship between these two? Thanks.
Hey guys, my name is Hamza. I'm an editor at Tanqeed, and I'm going to make some trouble because I feel like all I've heard are regurgitated stereotypes. I mean, can you not open any newspaper in Pakistan once a week and get all of these stories? I would expect that if we're sitting in DC talking about stories that we're not being told, I would want to hear about the wholesale copy-pasting of the Patriot Act into our legislation. I would want to hear about how the US government is pressuring the Pakistan government for not processing the Bagram base, or for not bringing the Bagram-based detainees case, which at Columbia's journalism school on the 27th, you guys are talking about that. I would want to hear about, you know, how union leaders are being jailed under legislation that is being introduced under the guise of anti-terrorism legislation, which the U.S. is pushing. Those are the stories we're not hearing in the U.S.
And last.
Hi, my name is Noreen. I'm a journalist at the PBS NewsHour. I think during the time I was standing in line, some of the questions have already sort of addressed what I'm about to talk about. But I wanted to touch back on this issue that Mr. Walsh, you mentioned about hitting narrative buttons. And I know that as journalists and filmmakers that are based in Pakistan, it's easier and more feasible for you to sort of get past, a lot of times, having to deal with hitting those same stories in the same manner over and over again, and sort of, you know, getting past that. But I'm wondering, for journalists that are based here that are interested in covering Pakistan, how is that something that we can get past? And is it even worthwhile to try and pursue that if we're reporting to an American audience?
Okay. And so before we take those three questions, I'm curious about the audience. Let's just do a hand poll. I'm very curious. Are these stories, the ones that we've been talking about today, are these stories you don't find, because this panel is about looking at what Americans aren't necessarily hearing. Is this something that you thought, raise your hand if you think that these are stories, you know, you're very used to hearing. If there are things that are they are what you think of when you think of Pakistan coverage. Okay, and those who think they're underreported or things that they often don't hear. Okay, I'd just like to get a sense from the audience. But yeah, if you guys want to take a stab at those three questions.
I'll just take Noreen's question. You know, I get asked that a lot, like how as a freelancer or as somebody based in in the US, how do you report from a place like Pakistan? And one of the things that I tell my students, and I tell other folks as well, is you don't need permission to go out and report on something. And people often get hung up on, oh, I have to sell the story to an editor who was at the New York Times or Washington Post before I have the authority to go out and report. And I don't think that's true. I mean, the best advice I got from someone was, go get tape, and then let us listen to it. So if you find someone absolutely powerful and you think that their story is worth telling, go and interview that person. Go come back with the material. I mean, it's a fraught idea also because I think freelancers are often exploited in this paradigm, but it also is liberating to know that you don't really need someone's permission to go out and report on a story like Kainats. I mean, you know, people often ask, why did you wait 3 years before having an editor look at your rough cut? And I just say, can you imagine like me sending a pitch to somebody and say, I want to spend 4 years following a rape case about a girl who may not have been raped. Like nobody would have taken that film. And I knew that, and I was totally fine with that. I believed that that story was worth telling, and I invested my own resources in doing that, and applied to reporting grants, and once it got to a rough cut, we showed it to Frontline, and that's when they came on board, and I'm okay with that. I mean, I think that you don't need permission to tell stories that you think are worth telling, and I would just encourage people to, if you think there's a story worth doing, go out and do it. And there are lots of great journalism organizations that will fund you to go there. I mean, I don't think I've ever paid for a ticket to go on a reporting trip to Pakistan. Journalism organizations like the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, the Fund for Investigative Journalism, those are some great places that if you have a good idea and you've done some legwork in reporting, they'll fund for you to go and tell that story. So I would encourage you guys to do that.
So one of the things I had asked, I think all of you to share earlier was one article, a film, a piece of work, something you would recommend people like pick up and read. Is there a favorite thing each of you can quickly share that you would recommend people watch or read or spend some time with?
I would recommend that everyone read a brilliant novel by Mohammed Hanif, a Karachi-based novelist and journalist, called A Case of Exploding Mangoes. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, I think there's no better, perhaps sort of to complicate the narrative of contemporary Pakistan. Goes inside Pakistan in an entirely different way, and does it through the contemporary novel form, which is an interesting way. But I'm sure I would be eager to hear what you all think about that.
I've just read 2 books recently, 2 novels on Pakistan by new writers, and both of which were really exciting in different ways. One's by a former policeman who wrote a book called The Prisoner, which is set in Karachi. It's not sort of high literature, but there's so many amazing writers coming out of Pakistan at the moment at the kind of high literature level. So there's Mohammed Hanif, Nadeem Aslam, Kamla Shamsi, Mohsin Hamid, of course. I mean, so many. But there's interestingly a sort of now, there's a Pakistani fiction, a popular fiction in English, so accessible to most of us, or to all of us, that takes on other genres. So The Prisoner is sort of like a cop novel, but it's set in Karachi, and it's actually, it's a pretty good story, and it gives a really interesting kind of way of telling the story of Karachi that often is missing from non-fiction versions. And then the most recent book I read is by Sabah Imtiaz, who's just written a book called Karachi You're Killing Me, which is basically sort of a Pakistani version, I don't know if any of you have read, of Bridget Jones's Diary, isn't that it? Yeah. So it's sort of, if you'll excuse the phrase, it's sort of like chicklet set in Karachi, but it follows a Karachi reporter, a female reporter, who's talking about her life and her love life and her working life, and of course it all hews quite closely to reality for anyone who's been to Karachi, and it's a lot of fun. So I think it's a really interesting kind of new way of looking at the country. Yeah.
Fantastic.
I was fascinated when I read a short story called The Quilt, written decades ago by a female writer, and I think you should totally worth checking out. You'll be blown away by just the I think the courage of this woman to write, in such interesting ways about sexuality, and I think it's worth a read. Yeah.
Richard?
Well, I like a primer that was written by my colleague, Pam Constable, of the Washington Post. She wrote a book called Playing with Fire, and it is not one of your typical historical, nonfiction accounts of starts with partition and goes forward and all that stuff. It's a lot of vignettes from around the country, and I think because she spent about 9 years told between Afghanistan and Pakistan, she has a good feel for it. So, Playing with Fire.
Unfortunately, I think the time is ending, and we didn't even get to broach a lot of the subjects that we talked about and the really rich range of all of your reporting, everything from sectarian attacks to incest survivors. There's so many stories you guys are telling. But fortunately, you're all online and you all use Twitter, and there is a hashtag, and you can tweet at these people, full permission, just ask them everything you want, and hopefully they will be kind and answer in 140 characters or less. But thank all of you for coming. It's such a great group, and thank all of you for being here and speaking. Thank you.